they certainly have evolved over the last number of years. So for anything between the structure of those JVs to the substance of those JVs, and ultimately, of course, naturally to their size. And I think at a high level, if we were to take JV agreements in the housing development or the placemaking sector, for example, if I was to say as a real estate practitioner, what was coming across our desks, back then and now, you could probably categorize those into exactly that. So what we were looking at back in the boom, bust and recovery periods over the last, say, 15 plus years. So I think, firstly, if we look to prior to the global financial crisis, the height of the property boom, I think two particular development JVs, housing development JVs would come to mind, being Adamstown and Cherrywood. And bearing in mind at that time, 15 years ago, they were really in their infancy and right at their very early stages. So very different to the kind of agreements we'd see now, and obviously far in advance to Hines' involvement there in Cherrywood, Gary. So what you would normally see would typically would be a suite of commercial arrangements between a handful of neighbouring landowners and developers joining together to say, right, who's going to do what in terms of securing planning, getting the appropriate infrastructure in place, and then building out and selling. And obviously, those agreements would document the handling of funding, which I think would be traditionally domestic retail bank development finance, and then obviously divvying out or distributing, profits and sales proceeds. So that's the kind of thing you might have seen 15 years ago. If you move on then to a number of years after the global financial crisis and the crash here in particular, obviously that period was marked by the absence of development and certainly the greater absence of development finance. So what you were mainly seeing there would be uncompleted or unfinished housing developments that may have been viable in terms of build out and sell. So what we were seeing was essentially the state, in the guise of either NAMA or the NTMA, effectively partnering with certain developers to fund those to build out and sell, obviously for the main purpose of either paying or writing down debt. And then lastly, if we look at where we are today, certainly it's a transformed market in terms of how JVs go. And I know when you alluded there to various kind of corporate structures and tax considerations, but what we are certainly seeing is now a more innovative and creative use of traditional property specific agreements. So we might take an alternative development agreement, the most extreme example perhaps being the PPP model, which we will all be aware of. There will also then be more bespoke licensing and licensing arrangements. And then, of course, we have the reemergence of forward purchase, some forward funding, and then sometimes typically a bit of a hybrid between those. So I think, in short, JVs are now far more common. They invariably involve international funding. And certainly in terms of the commercial arrangements, they're far more complex and sophisticated.